So this is a Kubota B2710. Right rear axle seal is leaking. I cleaned this thing up really good. In case you're not familiar with the whole deal, this is the axle seal, and that's where it's leaking. I confirmed that by cleaning off this whole axle housing, which has to come off with the axle itself, and made double dog sure that I really knew where it was leaking from. And also I didn't want to contaminate the inside of this any more than I had to, so I cleaned all the dirt off. And then I made a little thing to hold that piece up because it's pretty heavy. I've actually had this apart once before, a long time ago, to repair something internal. And so what I'm going to do is use my floor jack with this 6x6 and bolt it into these holes. I don't know what they're for. Must be for some other model of tractor or something. And support the entire weight of this thing when I start taking all these bolts out. And the hard part of this exercise is you have to remove these bolts from the subframe. And if I recall, I have to actually remove the bolts at the front and drop that whole gray piece that I'm pointing at to be able to get this casing out. So here's the setup now that I've got the brackets in place. When I start taking all these bolts out on the casing and the weight drops, it will shift over to this floor jack with these brackets that are screwed to that 6x6 and bolted into this piece on the casting. Okay, so one complication, if you have the auxiliary hydraulics block attached to your transmission like I do, it complicates this a little. This rod that my finger is on is the rod for the differential lock pedal. Normally it would pop right out of the hole here that it fits in. You probably can't quite see that, but anyway, there's a hole on a little lever here. But if you have this hydraulic block attached to your tractor, it blocks that thing being removed. So I had to release this thing to get it out of the way, to get that out of the way. So complication number one. Oh yeah, there you can see the hole now that it goes into right there. Okay, I got the piece of the frame dropped on the floor there. It's that gray piece that's reflecting light. That's the last thing that's blocking removal of this rear casing. So, and I removed the lower bolts on that casing because once I put my transmission jack in there, I'm not going to be able to get at those. So the next step is to just pull the thing out. Okay, well that came out pretty well once I got everything loose. You can see my little contraption here, which worked great, by the way. It's setting on my floor jack, rolled right out. Spring fell on the floor. I'm sure I can figure out where that went. Everything looks really good in there. I don't see any signs of metal or shavings or anything, so looks pretty good. All right, here it is up on the bench. This thing is really hard to handle if you don't have it up on a block or something like this, because this bearing and shaft can slide in and out a little bit, not completely, and the thing is not weighted equally, so the casing likes to spin around. So if you take this out, it's nice to have something to put it on. You can also stand it up on end on this flange, but a little bit wobbly for that. So next step is to clean everything up, pull the snap ring off of that shaft. Hopefully those bearings will come off easily, and then replace the seal. One thing I forgot to mention when I first started, I had drained the oil out of this side of the case. You know, there's two drain plugs under the tractor. So I drained the one on the right side, which also drains part of the center, the main transmission or rear differential, I guess it would be called. But it probably doesn't drain all of the left side, which is the other side of the tractor. So anyway, I do have quite a bit of oil on the floor, but that's because the drain plug isn't quite low enough to drain the case completely. So just make sure you drain this whole thing before you start doing this project. Okay, I had to use a little heat and this gear puller to get the bearing off. So there was a bearing assembly right here pressed onto this. It was a little tight, but I used a heat gun and some tin foil to shield the inner shaft. And I got it hot enough. It was probably 160, 180 degrees, and then it popped right off. And I just used a screwdriver to pop off this seal and back, and it came right out, no problem. Okay, to get the outer bearing, which you can just barely see in there at the end of my screwdriver, it's pressed onto the shaft, the axle shaft. And so I'm just whacking it with a rubber hammer, whacking the shaft this way because the bearing seats against a shoulder in here. And that seems to be working. Okay, got it apart. You can see that's the case, which now is heavy and lays down. Here's the axle. The bearing was in there. That popped out once I got the axle shaft out. Okay, I'm getting ready to put the seal back in. I cleaned up the surface that seal rides on. I know it's impossible to see this stuff in a video, but right at the edge of my little orange pry bar, there's kind of a streak. And this is where the outer wiper of the seal was riding. And when they paint the tractor, they paint it after they have this all assembled. So there was gray paint right up to that spot where the first wiper is. I think it kind of created a little bit of an abrasive. I mean, I can't squawk after 19 years. Pretty good service. But anyway, that might have been what contributed to the leak on the seal. Working on reassembly, you can see that the bearing, the outer bearing for the axle is in. I made a wooden plug about the same diameter as the bearing, and I had an oak dowel. And I heated the casing with this heat gun, which is a pretty high power heat gun, and I stuck the bearing in the freezer for about an hour, and it just plopped right in there, had no problem. So next step is to put the axle in through that bearing. Okay, ran into a slight problem here. That bearing, the outer bearing, the one closest to the tire, really dropped in without any interference at all, and I thought that was because I had put it in the freezer and heated the casing a little bit, but even after everything equalized in temperature, I could, with some effort, push that out with my hands. And when I looked at the old bearing, the reason I changed the bearing was you can see there's some evidence that this is spun. It's not a lot, and it's hard. I know it's hard to see stuff on these crazy reflective surfaces, but that's why I decided to change the bearing since it's cheap and a lot of labor to get in here. So anyway, I didn't feel comfortable with the looseness it had, so I went and got some bearing retainer. There's different kinds. Loctite makes some. Our local store had this stuff. It's called Permatex sleeve retainer. I don't know if you can see that, if it's focused. But the stuff you put on it bonds to the outside of the bearing and to the case that it's supposed to be pressed into. And this is actually what it's really designed for. I've never used it before, but it can't hurt. I'm not going to spend the money to try to remachine this or do anything to make it more of a press fit. But you got to wait 24 hours for it to dry, so back at you tomorrow. So here's another little tip. Fortunately, I took pictures and video when I took it apart. This cog for the differential lock has to be in a position that these cogs don't interfere with the cogs on the differential itself. So when you attach this case to the tractor, there's a cog that mates with this, and if you happen to put it in a position where this cog lines up right on top of the other one, you'll never get the case together. So it doesn't have to be exactly on any particular spline, but like if the cog on the tractor is at the 12 and 6 o'clock position, put this one at 3 and 9 o'clock. That gives yourself plenty of room so that it doesn't interfere. I actually made a small mark, only by luck. I didn't know why I made the mark, but I just realized that it actually helps. So pay attention to that if you take this apart. Things are back together. Here's how I did it. I took the axle shaft itself and I put it outside. Fortunately, Chicago weather, it was about 25-30 last night, so I left that out all night long. The case, I put a piece of tin foil in the bore where the shaft goes into. So I stuffed this tin foil in there and then used a heat gun blowing in this direction to heat this whole area up. The casting itself and the bearing that's already been pressed inside that casting. I had those up to about 200, 225 degrees, and the shaft was down to about probably 25. And then I brought it in and I threaded the seal onto this, but I didn't drive it home. And I inserted the shaft into that bearing until it got to the shoulder. And then I tipped this whole assembly upright. I separated the planks on my workbench so that the shaft could fit through it. And then I used a dead blow hammer to strike the end of the flange on the axle. And it went in. It was a bit tough, but it went in. And then after that went in, while the axle shaft was still cool, I slid the ring gear or the gear back on. And this bearing, I heated up with the heat gun to about 250 degrees. And it was also a little tough going on. I used this socket. Once I got it on most of the way, I put that socket on the inner race and just beat the daylights out of it with a dead blow hammer. And it finally went on. And it goes on till the point where the snap ring just fits. So the next step is to just put some of these other differential lock parts together. And that'll be it. Okay. I've snow plowed 2, maybe 3 times. Parked it over a little jar and in the driveway and didn't get a drop of oil. So I'm going to call this a success.